They told her the decision was final, but the room said otherwise. Inside the underground command center, the air was thick with recycled oxygen and restrained fear, the kind that didn't shout but pressed down on the chest. Giant digital maps covered the curved walls, glowing with red threat markers that crawled across an entire region like a spreading infection. Every few seconds, a new symbol blinked into existence: enemy units mobilizing, missile convoys shifting, borders bleeding. Officers murmured updates into headsets, their voices steady but their eyes betraying them. This war was slipping out of control, and everyone in the room knew it. She stood near the back, helmet tucked under her arm, posture relaxed in a way that made people uneasy. Her file had been circulated hours ago, classified, redacted, stamped with warnings, but it didn't need details. Everyone here knew the rumors. Lone operations that rewrote doctrine. Missions where casualty reports stopped making sense. Situations that ended not because of negotiations, but because there was no one left to negotiate with. She had been flown in as an option of last resort, the kind you hope never becomes necessary. The general at the center console cleared his throat. After careful consideration, he said, choosing each word like it might explode, "We've determined that deploying you would create uncontrollable variables." She didn't react. She had heard versions of this speech before. "You are," another officer added, glancing down at a tablet instead of meeting her eyes, "too dangerous to deploy." The sentence landed heavier than any insult. Too dangerous. For whom? For the enemy, or for the neat structure of command, the chain of permissions and authorizations that made war feel manageable? Around the room, no one disagreed. No one nodded either. Silence filled the space, broken only by the low hum of servers calculating outcomes that no longer favored them. The general continued, "We'll proceed with containment, air superiority, and diplomatic pressure. You were ordered to stand down." Stand down. The phrase echoed in her mind, hollow and familiar. She looked at the map again. She saw what the models refused to admit. Airstrikes would harden resistance, negotiations would stall, and containment would fail. The war wouldn't end, it would metastasize. Cities would burn slowly instead of quickly. Soldiers would die in increments instead of moments. She finally spoke. Her voice was calm, almost gentle. "How many hours until escalation?" The analysts exchanged glances. "Less than 48, one admitted." "And civilian zones?" she asked. "Within the week." She nodded once. No anger, no argument, just confirmation of what she already knew. The general straightened. "This isn't a debate. You are dismissed." She turned and walked toward the exit, boots quiet against the polished floor. Cameras tracked her movement until the blast doors slid shut behind her, sealing the command center back into its controlled panic. For a moment, she stood alone in the dim corridor, lit by emergency strips along the floor. Her reflection stared back at her from the dark metal wall, unremarkable, almost forgettable. Exactly how she preferred it. As she moved down the corridor, alerts flared behind the sealed doors. Another enemy unit had crossed a line. Another warning, another delay. The machine of war grinding forward, obedient to process instead of reality. She reached the armory level, where guards stood out of habit more than necessity. They stiffened when they saw her, unsure whether to stop her. She didn't slow down. Her clearance still worked. Red lights turned green. Doors opened. Systems obeyed, even if people no longer wanted them to. Inside the prep bay, her gear waited, custom-fitted. Stripped of insignia, built for one purpose only. She ran a hand over the matte surface of her rifle, checking it the way others checked their pulse. This wasn't rebellion. It wasn't defiance for its own sake. It was inevitability. They could label her too dangerous all they wanted. But danger wasn't a flaw. It was a solution they were afraid to use. Somewhere far above, generals debated containment strategies and diplomatic wording. Somewhere beyond the border, enemy forces prepared for a war they believed would take months, maybe years. And in the quiet beneath it all, she finished gearing up, already gone in her mind, already moving through terrain no map could fully capture. Orders had been given. She had heard them. She was just no longer bound by them. Night swallowed the land the moment she crossed the border, a vast, breath-holding darkness broken only by distant fires and the occasional sweep of searchlights. The insertion had not been authorized, which meant there were no drones overhead, no satellite eyes tracking her progress, no voice in her ear correcting her course. Just silence, wind moving through dry grass, and the steady rhythm of her own breathing. She welcomed it. This was how she worked best. Unobserved, unrecorded, unencumbered by permission. She moved low and fast, following terrain rather than paths, letting the ground decide her route. The enemy had fortified the valley believing numbers equaled security. Trenches layered over trenches, overlapping patrols, armored units positioned like chess pieces waiting for orders. On paper, it was a nightmare. On the ground, it was predictable. Predictability bred complacency, and complacency was something she had learned to hear long before it showed itself. The first patrol never knew what passed through them. She slipped between their arcs of vision, her timing precise to the second, her presence no more disruptive than a change in temperature. When one soldier paused, uneasy for reasons he couldn't name, she was already gone, leaving behind nothing but doubt. Within minutes, their comms began to misbehave, short bursts of static, delays just long enough to frustrate. She wasn't destroying their systems yet. She was shaping their expectations. Farther in, the command relay sat half buried in rock, shielded against airstrikes and designed to survive weeks of bombardment. Its defenses faced outward, thick and confident. She approached from below, where rock met shadow and engineers had assumed gravity was defense enough. A single controlled breach, silent and exact, opened a path. Inside, the air smelled of metal and stale coffee. Screens glowed, operators leaning forward in their chairs, unaware they were already losing. She moved through the facility like a thought, disconnecting rather than destroying. Data links severed, backups corrupted just enough to be unreliable. Orders went out twisted, arriving late or wrong. Units advanced when they should have held. Others held when they should have withdrawn. Confusion spread not as panic but as hesitation, the most dangerous delay in combat. By the time the first alarm sounded, it was already meaningless. She was gone, back into the terrain, the valley echoing with questions instead of gunfire. Enemy commanders argued over contradictory reports. Some insisted nothing was wrong. Others demanded immediate escalation. The chain of command tightened on itself, paralyzed by the absence of clarity. She used that paralysis to strike again. At dawn, armored columns rolled out on orders that contradicted each other, colliding with terrain they weren't prepared for. She watched from a ridge as dust rose and formations broke. A single well-placed shot disabled a lead vehicle, turning an advance into a bottleneck. Another shot severed a communications mast miles away, plunging 3 units into isolation. She never stayed long enough to be seen. The valley did the work for her once the balance tipped. Rumors began to move faster than troops. Soldiers whispered about a lone operator, impossible to track, everywhere and nowhere. Some said she was a unit. Others said she was a weapon that had escaped its handlers. Fear crept in not because of losses, but because there was no pattern to fight. Every shadow became a threat. Every order was questioned. By the second night, friendly fire incidents erupted as nerves frayed. Commanders demanded air support, but without reliable coordinates, strikes were delayed. She exploited every pause, every argument, every second of indecision. Precision replaced spectacle. She dismantled supply lines instead of units, leaving battalions intact but useless. Food ran low. Fuel vanished. Ammunition existed only on paper. When enemy leadership finally understood the scale of what was happening, it was too late to respond cleanly. Retreat meant exposure. Advance meant walking into uncertainty. Holding ground meant slow collapse. She had turned the battlefield into a puzzle with no correct answer. As darkness fell again, she paused on high ground, watching an entire front line dim into scattered lights and broken signals. No triumphant feeling touched her. Just a quiet confirmation. Wars weren't ended by force alone, but by the moment one side realized it had already lost control. And down in the valley, that realization was beginning to spread. By the third night, the valley had become a ghost landscape, familiar yet unrecognizable. Fires flickered in abandoned bunkers, and the occasional flare illuminated soldiers frozen in confusion, unsure whether to fight or flee. She moved silently across ridges and dry riverbeds, watching, listening, calculating. There was no exhilaration in her actions, only method. The battlefield had become a living puzzle, and she was the only piece capable of fitting where it mattered most. Her objective was simple: end the war. Her method, however, was far from conventional. Enemy units were still present, but disorganized, like a hive struck too quickly. Convoys stalled in narrow canyons, infantry clusters clashed in mistaken coordination, and communications remained fractured. She had learned to trust these fractures as much as her own instincts. Every movement she made, every calculated disruption, exploited the enemy's overconfidence. They still believed in their numbers, in their heavy artillery, in the rules they had always followed. She had rewritten all of that without firing a single conventional salvo. She approached the central command hub, the heart of their operations, undetected. The building was heavily guarded, and anyone else attempting this would have failed instantly. But she was not anyone else. She crouched in shadows just outside, watching patrols rotate, memorizing patterns, timing each step down to fractions of a second. Then she moved, fluid, precise, silent. Every obstacle was anticipated, every sound accounted for. The guards never saw her, only sensed the shift too late. Inside, she accessed the network, fingers flying over controls she didn't need to study. Systems responded to her touch as though recognizing an old master, doors unlocking, cameras looping, comms rerouting. She injected misinformation, severed critical supply lines, and redirected battalions into positions where they could no longer support each other. Chaos spread like wildfire, and she withdrew before anyone could comprehend the scale of what had just happened. Outside, she watched the ripple effects unfold. Enemy commanders were shouting over radios that no longer delivered coherent updates. Orders contradicted previous orders. Units stumbled into ambushes of their own making. Tanks stalled in trenches they had assumed were clear. Artillery misfired or targeted the wrong coordinates, and reconnaissance drones were hijacked to deliver misinformation. In hours, the momentum of an entire war had shifted, not through brute force, but through strategy, precision, and understanding human error. She paused at the edge of a ridge, surveying the valley below. The full impact of her work revealed itself in small, telling details: scattered soldiers signaling each other in confusion, supply caches left untouched but unreachable, roads blocked by their own forces' mistakes. It was the battlefield transformed, not by destruction alone, but by the absence of control. Where once there had been order, there was now only hesitation, doubt, and fear. As the sun began to rise, flags that once marked fortified positions were replaced by white cloths, makeshift signals of surrender. Small groups emerged cautiously, hands raised, scanning the ridges and hillsides as if expecting another phantom to strike. They had learned, finally, that this was no conventional assault. The war, which had stretched over months, possibly years of preparation and maneuvering, collapsed under the weight of unpredictability. She had done it alone. She made her way back through the ridges and valleys, keeping to shadows, avoiding detection even as enemy forces began to comprehend the defeat they had suffered. No celebration accompanied her, no medals awaited in the command center. Only silence, only the stillness of a world that had survived because of the choices of one person willing to break every rule. By the time she returned to friendly lines, command officers were still attempting to reconcile reports that made no sense. Entire battalions were unaccounted for. Maps were inconsistent, and the war that had seemed inevitable was over. They stared at her quietly, realizing what had happened, unable to articulate it without feeling the weight of their own hesitation and oversight. She simply removed her gear, set it aside, and walked out of the tent. No one followed. No one asked questions. She didn't need them to. The valley below, now silent, had become a testament to what one person could do when unbound by orders. And as she disappeared into the quiet dawn, one thing was certain: wars could be fought with soldiers, but they could also be ended by those who understood the battlefield in ways no protocol could measure. The enemy had surrendered, the war was over, and the legend of the woman, too dangerous to deploy, had been written not in reports, but in the absence of conflict, in the stillness of the battlefield she had mastered alone.